I've never shared a bed, the black bride whispered on her wedding night. Her hands trembled against the hard chest of the giant cowboy. He cupped her face with callous tenderness, his voice a low rumble. Then tonight you'll share my heart, too. The frontier town of Copper Gulch had watched her arrive months before. She was the uppity woman from the east, with her fancy clothes and her educated tongue. They all expected the wilderness to break her, to send her crawling back where she came from. They whispered she wouldn't last a week, just another outsider, crushed by an unforgiving land. But the gentle mountain man, the giant cowboy who was now her husband, had seen something different in her fierce eyes. Something that reminded him of his own buried pain, his own lost dreams. What the town didn't know, what nobody knew, was that she carried a secret. Her murdered father's secret. A secret so explosive, it could destroy the powerful men who ruled this town through fear and blood. Would her wedding night be the moment she finally found safety in the arms of a man she loved? Or would revealing the truth just make her the next person to disappear into the dust? The stagecoach had lurched to a stop in front of the land office, dust swirling like a pack of nervous ghosts. Evangeline Booker stepped down onto the creaking boardwalk. Her navy traveling dress and her polished boots might as well have been a sign painted on her back. Foreigner, outsider, prey. Every eye in town followed her. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman on the other side of the street clutched her child's hand and hurried away as if Eve was a plague. Eve just lifted her chin. She walked straight toward the land office, her small carpet bag clutched in her hand. Inside her purse, the inheritance papers crinkled, a sound like dry leaves, like a promise from a dead man. Her father's homestead was out there somewhere, beyond these hostile stares, beyond this wall of silence. He had written to her about Wyoming, about the opportunities you couldn't find back east. He just forgot to mention the welcome she'd receive. Or maybe he knew, and he was trying to warn her. The clerk inside the land office didn't even bother to look up at first. Samuel Morrison, the nameplate read. He had thinning hair and the kind of eyes that had already judged you and found you guilty. I'm here about the Booker property, Eve said. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was hammering. She placed the inheritance documents on his desk. Samuel gave the papers a look you'd give a piece of rotten meat. These look irregular to me, he said, pushing them back. Can't process irregular documents. What exactly appears irregular? He shrugged, enjoying himself. Well, I'd need to verify. That could take weeks, maybe months. The door chimed behind her. Heavy boots stomped across the floorboards. A shadow fell over her, and a voice dripped with false concern. Problem here, Sam. It was Sheriff McKenna. His badge caught the afternoon light, a single blinding star of malice. No problem at all, Sheriff, the clerk said, suddenly very helpful. Just explaining procedure to this young lady. McKenna looked Eve up and down, his eyes calculating, like a butcher sizing up a cow. You Moses Booker's daughter? He asked. Heard about his accident. Real shame. Him falling off that cliff like that. Something in his tone, a flicker of satisfaction, made Eve's skin crawl. Yes, Sheriff. I've come to claim my inheritance. Of course you have, he said, a thin smile playing on his lips. Sam here will take good care of you. Won't you, Sam? The clerk nodded so fast his head bobbled. Absolutely, Sheriff. McKenna tipped his hat and left, but his presence lingered like the smell of sulfur. Suddenly, Sam the clerk found a dozen more problems with her paperwork. She needed additional documentation. She needed witness statements. She needed property surveys that would take months to complete. The list was designed to be impossible. It was a wall of paper, and she was meant to break herself against it. Eve gathered her useless documents and walked back out into the oppressive sunlight. Next door was the general store. The bell over the door jangled like a warning. The proprietor quoted her prices that were double what he'd charged the white woman just ahead of her in line. A pound of flour suddenly cost a fortune. She paid anyway. She added every single overcharge to a list she was keeping in her head. A list of injustices. A list of debts that would be paid. The hotel clerk told her they were full, even as she could see the keys to empty rooms hanging on the wall behind him. The restaurant had no available tables, though half the room was empty. The town was closing ranks. It was a fortress, and she was on the outside. Frustration and anger built inside her chest, hot and sharp. She sat on a bench outside the land office, the sun beating down, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. Her options were dwindling with every passing minute. Then a shadow fell across her, a shadow so big it blocked out the sun. She looked up and up, into the face of a man larger than any she had ever seen. He stood 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that looked like they could carry a mountain. His weathered hat shadowed a face carved by sun and wind and hard work. "You Moses Booker's daughter?" he asked. His voice was a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. Eve tensed. She was ready for another fight, another insult. "I am. Name's Jediah Carter," he said, and then he did something that shocked her. He took off his hat. "Folks call me Jed." He had kind eyes, eyes that didn't match his intimidating size, eyes that held a hint of sadness. "Your father was a good man," Jed said. "Helped me when others wouldn't." The wall around Eve's heart cracked, just a little. "You knew him? Did some business together? He mentioned he had a daughter back east. Said you had more brains than half the territory combined." It was the first kind word she'd heard since she arrived, the first hint that she wasn't entirely alone. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jed continued, his voice soft. "Moses didn't deserve what happened to him." The sheriff called it an accident. A strange look flickered across Jed's face, there and gone in an instant. "Did he now?" Right at that moment, as if on cue, the strap on her carpet bag gave way. Her belongings spilled across the dusty street. Books, papers, a small sewing kit. Jed was on his knees in an instant, helping her collect everything. His massive, calloused hands handled her delicate things with a surprising gentleness. He was a walking contradiction, a giant with a soft touch. "Property out there's been sitting empty 2 years," he said, gathering her books. "Might be rough going." "I can manage rough going." He actually smiled at that, a real smile that reached his kind eyes. "I believe you can," he said. "But evening's coming on. The territory can be dangerous after dark. Mind if I escort you out there?" Eve looked at this giant stranger. She weighed her options. Trust him, or spend the night on a bench in a town that wanted her gone, or dead. There was something in his manner, a quiet decency that reminded her of the way her father wrote about the few good men he'd met in a largely indecent world. It was a risk. Everything was a risk. But staying here felt like a certainty, a certain end. "I'd appreciate that," she said. Jed's wagon was sturdy, well-maintained, like the man himself. They rode in a comfortable silence as the town and its oppressive atmosphere fell away behind them. The rolling hills were dotted with scrub brush and wildflowers, painted in the fading light. It was a beautiful land, ruled by ugly men. "Your father's place has good water rights," Jed said after a while, breaking the silence. "Controls access to some prime grazing land." "Is that valuable?" Eve asked. "Very," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "I'm surprised nobody's tried to claim it already." His words hung in the air, a quiet warning. They crested a ridge, and there it was, the homestead. The cabin was weathered but solid. The small barn leaned a little, but it was still standing. Behind it, mountains rose up like sleeping giants, their peaks turning orange and purple in the sunset. "It's beautiful," Eve breathed. It was the first time she felt like she could breathe since she arrived. "Your father thought so too," Jed said quietly. They unloaded her things as the last of the light bled from the sky. Jed went to check the cabin's condition, making sure it was sound. Eve walked the property, her property, feeling a connection to the father she had lost. Inside, the cabin was covered in a thick layer of dust. Cold ashes sat in the fireplace, a memory of a fire long since extinguished. It was a lonely place, but it was hers. As she ran a hand along the dusty windowsill, her fingers brushed against a loose board. Curious, she pried it away from the wall, and behind it, tucked away in the darkness, was a leather-bound journal. She pulled it out. The pages were filled with her father's familiar, neat handwriting. But this wasn't a diary. It was filled with land surveys, legal notes, names, and dates. Dates that made her pulse hammer against her ribs. She saw references to irregularities in property transfers. She saw notes on the suspicious timing of accidents. Her father hadn't been a simple homesteader, trying to build a new life. He had been documenting a crime, something big, something that had gotten him thrown from a cliff, and she was holding the evidence in her hands. By the dim glow of an oil lamp, Eve spread her father's journal across the rough-hewn kitchen table. The pages didn't tell the story of a homesteader. They told the story of a hunter. Moses Booker hadn't come to Wyoming to settle the land. He'd come to investigate it. He was a federal land inspector sent to uncover a massive systematic theft of property across the entire territory. And the names in his journal made her blood run cold. Sheriff McKenna. His name appeared over and over again. Bank President Harrison Wild. Judge Coleman Harris. They were all in it together. A pack of wolves dressed in the clothes of civic leaders. The pattern was sickeningly clear. A black family would establish a homestead. They'd work the land, build a life. Then a valuable resource would be discovered nearby. Gold, water rights, grazing land. And then accidents would start to happen. Fires, rock slides, men falling from cliffs. And soon after, the property would be transferred to white ownership for pennies on the dollar, with Judge Harris signing off on the forged paperwork and Bank President Wild handling the money. It was a machine for stealing lives and land, but it was her father's final entry that stopped her heart. Silver vein confirmed beneath homestead. Must report to federal authorities immediately. McKenna suspects my investigation. Time running short. The date of the entry was the exact day he died. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. And now she was living on top of the motive. A sudden sharp knock on the cabin door made her jump so hard she nearly screamed. She slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding in her throat. Who was out there? McKenna? His men? Had they followed her? Everything all right in there? A voice called from the darkness. It was Jed. Saw your light burning late. Eve took a shaky breath and opened the door. He stood on her porch, holding a covered basket, and the look on his weathered face was one of genuine concern. Brought some supplies, he said. Figured you might need the basics to get started. He handed her the basket. Inside was fresh bread, eggs from his own chickens, coffee, and canned goods. It was a simple act of kindness in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. It almost made her cry. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. That's very thoughtful. Jed's kind eyes were studying her face. He saw the fear she was trying to hide. Something wrong? Eve had a choice to make. Trust was a dangerous currency in this town, but being alone was a death sentence. She looked at Jed, at the quiet strength in his face, and she made her decision. Can I ask you something? She said, her voice low. Do you know anything about unusual property transfers in this area? Jed's jaw tightened. The kindness in his eyes was replaced by a hard, knowing light. Why do you ask? My father's journal, she said, nodding toward the table. It mentions some concerning patterns. He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read every secret she held. Finally, he let out a long, heavy sigh. My family lost our original ranch 5 years ago, he said, his voice flat and hard. Legal complications, they called it. Forged documents suddenly appeared, claiming we never had a clear title. Judge Harris ruled against us. The same Judge Harris from my father's notes. Your father was documenting the thefts, Jed said. It wasn't a question. Eve nodded. He was a federal land inspector. He was building a case against them. These weren't random accidents. Jed's massive hands, the same hands that had been so gentle with her books, clenched into fists the size of stones. They murdered him. I believe so, Eve whispered. And now they want this property. They want the silver. The silver deposits, Jed repeated. His eyes widened slightly. You knew? Suspected, he admitted. Your father. He asked me to keep an eye on things if anything ever happened to him. He said if you came out here, I should watch out for you. Emotion tightened Eve's throat. Her father had been trying to protect her, even from beyond the grave. He had left her a guardian angel, a 6.5-foot tall guardian angel. What do we do now? She asked, the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on her. Jed looked from her to the journal on the table, and a spark of defiance lit up his eyes. We gather proof, he said, his voice a low growl. Real proof, the kind that federal authorities can't ignore. The war had begun. Over the next few weeks, the homestead became a war room. Jed became her teacher. He taught her how to survive in a land that wanted her dead. He showed her how to ride a horse not like a lady from the East, but like a woman of the frontier. He taught her how to handle cattle, how to mend a fence, and how to use her father's old rifle. She was a quick study. The fire in her eyes that Jed had seen was fueled by a desire for justice. Her sharp mind from her Eastern education was the perfect weapon to combine with Jed's practical knowledge of the territory. She understood the law. He understood the land. Together, they started piecing together the full, ugly picture of the land fraud operation. And then help arrived from the most unexpected place. The town dressmaker, a woman named Maddie Sinclair, rode out to the homestead. She said she was there to take measurements for new clothes. But as soon as they were alone inside the cabin, her real purpose came out. "I've been watching the property transfers too," Maddie confessed in a quiet, urgent voice. "My late husband, Thomas, was a clerk at the courthouse. He started noticing the patterns before he died. Another suspicious death, another convenient accident. The conspiracy was a cancer, and it had spread deeper than Eve had ever imagined. I kept his notes," Maddie continued, her eyes flashing with a secret fire. "I hid them in my shop. I never knew what to do with them. Until now." The three of them, the educated woman, the giant rancher, and the grieving widow, formed an unlikely alliance. They were three sparks of light in a world of darkness. Maddie's records were the missing piece of the puzzle. They filled in the gaps in Moses Booker's journal. Names connected, dates lined up. The whole criminal network laid itself bare. McKenna was the muscle, leading the operation with his badge and his gun. Judge Harris was the legal cover, turning theft into law with the stroke of a pen. And Bank President Wild was the money man, laundering the stolen properties through a web of shell companies. They had destroyed at least a dozen families, stolen everything they had. But gathering the evidence was like walking through a minefield. McKenna's men were watching. Strange accidents began to happen at Eve's homestead. Her cattle were scattered in the middle of the night. Her fences were cut, morning after morning. One day, the water from her well tasted bitter, like poison. She had to boil every drop. McKenna himself started visiting more often. He'd prowl around the property, his eyes searching, asking pointed questions about her father's things. He was looking for the journal. He knew it had to be somewhere. "Mighty big place for a woman all alone," he said during one visit, his voice slick with menace. "Sure you can handle all this responsibility?" "I'm managing just fine, Sheriff." "Of course you are," he said with a cold smile. "Just hate to see another accident happen. This territory is dangerous for folks who don't understand its ways." The threat was as clear as a gunshot. Jed's presence helped. He spent more and more time at her homestead, but he couldn't be there every second. He had his own ranch to run. Eve learned to sleep with her father's rifle by her side, her finger near the trigger. Every shadow was a threat. Every sound in the night was an enemy. One evening, Jed rode up to the cabin at a full gallop, his face grim. He didn't even wait for a greeting. "Pack light," he said, his voice urgent. "You're staying at my ranch tonight." "What's wrong?" "I saw tracks around your property. Too many boots for honest business. They're planning something. Tonight." Eve didn't hesitate. She grabbed a few essential items and her father's journal. They rode through the moonless night to Jed's ranch, which was larger and more defensible. His cabin had thicker walls and a clear view of the surrounding land. It was a fortress. As they settled in, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, Eve had to ask, "Why are you doing all this? Why are you helping me?" Jed stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because your father would have done the same for anyone." He took a step closer. "And," he said, his voice dropping lower. He met her eyes directly, and the air between them crackled with unspoken energy. "Because I care about what happens to you." In that moment, everything shifted. The dangerous attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke through. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. "We need to act soon," she said, her voice a little breathless. "The evidence won't matter if we're dead." "Agreed," Jed said. "But we need a plan. A plan that doesn't get us killed. Eve opened the journal to the final pages. Her father's last entry. He had mentioned contacting his federal supervisor, a man in Denver who could authorize arrests, who could bring the full weight of the U.S. government down on Copper Gulch. "There's a federal marshal my father worked with," she said. "If we can get word to him." "That's a 3-day ride to Denver," Jed said. "And they're watching our every move. One of us would have to make that ride and hope they make it." They sat in silence, the terrible weight of their options pressing down on them. Outside, a coyote howled, a lonely, mournful sound. It sounded like a warning. Jed knelt beside her chair. The firelight played across his strong, weathered face. He took her hands in his calloused touch sending a shiver through her. "Marry me," he said. The words were so simple, so direct, they stole the air from her lungs. "Jed, not just because I love you," he said, his gaze intense, "though I do." His thumb traced a line across her knuckles. "Because it gives you legal protection. As my wife, it makes you harder to remove, harder to intimidate." And it was the most romantic and the most practical proposal in the history of the world. A declaration of love that was also a tactical maneuver in a deadly war. Eve understood the cold logic of the frontier. A single woman was vulnerable. A married woman, whose husband was a man like Jed, commanded a different kind of respect. "You're proposing for strategic reasons." "I'm proposing because I can't imagine my life without you in it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The protection is just practical sense." Eve looked into his sincere eyes. Her heart had been his for weeks, she realized. She had fallen in love with him while mending fences and planning a revolution. She had seen his strength, his intelligence, his unwavering decency. In a world of lies, he was the only truth she knew. "Yes," she whispered. A slow smile spread across Jed's face, transforming him. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, as if he would never let go. For a single, perfect moment, the conspiracy and the danger and the fear all faded away. But only for a moment. Reality came crashing back in. A marriage meant a public ceremony. A public ceremony would draw the entire town. And McKenna and his vultures would be watching. They would see their union as a threat. Or worse, an opportunity. A new idea, audacious and terrifying, sparked in Eve's mind. "We'll use the wedding as our moment," she said, pulling back to look at him. "We'll invite the whole town. We'll make our evidence presentation part of the celebration." Jed's eyes widened. "That's risky. They'll be expecting something." "They'll be expecting a simple frontier wedding," Eve countered, the plan taking shape. "They won't be expecting a federal case to be laid out at their feet." Jed stared at her, a look of awe on his face. Then he nodded slowly. "When?" "Soon," Eve said, her voice hard as steel. "Before they make their next move against us." The wedding would be a trap, and they were the bait. The news of the engagement hit Copper Gulch like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Some of the townsfolk were genuinely happy. Most just whispered behind their hands, disapproving, suspicious, and McKenna's faction. They watched. They watched with cold, calculating eyes, trying to figure out the angle. Maddie, the dressmaker, threw herself into the wedding preparations with a fiery enthusiasm that was the perfect cover. Her frequent visits to the homestead weren't just about dress fittings. They were about coordinating the final stages of their plan. "I've contacted 3 families who are willing to testify," she reported one afternoon, her mouth full of pins. "The Washingtons, who lost their farm 2 years ago. The Martinez family, whose ranch was seized last spring. They're all scared, but they're ready." "Will they risk speaking out in public?" Eve asked. "For a chance at justice?" Maddie said, her eyes hard. "Yes. Fear has kept them quiet for too long." Meanwhile, Eve wrote a carefully coded letter. It was addressed to her father's federal contact in Denver, a U.S. Marshal named James Harrison. She told him everything. The journal, the conspiracy, the stolen land. She told him the date and time of her wedding. She prayed it would reach him in time. She prayed he was a man who could be trusted. As the wedding day approached, McKenna turned up the heat. His deputies started patrolling past Eve's property every single day, a constant, silent threat. The bank, run by Harrison Wild, suddenly threatened to foreclose on her homestead, claiming a fabricated debt her father had supposedly left behind. Then the anonymous warning started. Notes nailed to her fence posts in the dead of night. Getting married won't save you. Another one read, some accidents can't be prevented. Jed moved into the barn at the homestead, telling everyone he was just helping with preparations. But they both knew the real reason. He was a human shield. His presence kept McKenna's men from making a direct move, but the psychological warfare was relentless. The week before the wedding, the enemy moved their pieces into position. Judge Harris announced a surprise emergency court session to review what he called irregularities in Eve's property claim. It was scheduled for the day after the wedding. Bank President Wild had the foreclosure documents drawn up and ready to file, and Sheriff McKenna arranged for extra deputies to be brought in from neighboring towns for security. They were setting a trap. They planned to let the wedding happen, and then, immediately after, they would strike. They would use the judge to declare her claim invalid, the banker to foreclose, and the sheriff to throw her off the land, or worse. Eve and Jed saw the trap closing in around them, but they didn't run. They walked right towards it. Their own plan, their counter-trap, depended on perfect timing and a level of courage that bordered on insanity. If this goes wrong, Eve said, the night before their wedding, her voice barely a whisper. It won't go wrong, Jed said, his voice a rock of certainty. But if it does... He took her face in his massive hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then we'll face whatever comes, together. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a beautiful day for a public execution. Maddie arrived early to help Eve get ready, but she didn't bring congratulations. She brought terrifying news. McKenna's men are positioned all around town, she whispered, her hands shaking as she helped Eve with her dress. They're not here for a wedding. They're planning something big. And the federal marshal? Eve asked, her heart sinking. Maddie shook her head. No sign of him. The message. It might not have gotten through. This was it. The moment of truth. Without federal authority, their evidence was just words. Their presentation would just be a list of accusations. McKenna could arrest them for slander before they even finished speaking. He could shut them down, and no one would stop him. Eve looked at her reflection in the small mirror. She saw the fear in her own eyes, but underneath it, she saw the fire. The same fire Jed had seen. Her father's fire. We proceed anyway, she said, her voice steady. Truth deserves to be spoken, even if no one acts on it. The ceremony was set for high noon, right in the middle of the town square. It seemed like every single person in Copper Gulch was there. Some came to celebrate. Most came to watch the spectacle, like a public hanging. Eve wore her mother's simple white dress, which Maddie had altered to fit her perfectly. Jed stood at the makeshift altar, looking impossibly large and handsome in his best suit. And there, right in the front row, was Sheriff McKenna. His badge glinted in the sun, a polished piece of corruption. Judge Harris stood beside him, ready to perform the ceremony, the irony so thick it was sickening. Bank President Wild lurked nearby, flanked by his cronies. The wolves were all gathered. The trap was set. The bait had arrived. Reverend Matthews began to speak. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Eve's eyes scanned the crowd. She memorized every face, the friendly ones, the hostile ones, the curious ones. Do you, Jediah Carter, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Jed's voice boomed, strong and clear. Do you, Evangeline Booker, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Eve's voice rang out across the silent square. I do. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, Judge Harris said with a smug smile, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jed kissed her, a brief, gentle touch. The crowd applauded, and as the applause died down, McKenna stepped forward. Congratulations to the happy couple, he announced, his voice slick and loud. Now, if I might have everyone's attention, there's some urgent legal business to address regarding the Booker property. This was it. The trap was springing. He was going to arrest her on fabricated charges right here, in front of the entire town. The conspiracy was about to win, publicly and permanently. But before he could say another word, Eve stepped forward. "Actually, Sheriff," she said, her voice calm and clear, "I have something to share with everyone first. Think of it as a wedding gift. To the community." She reached into her small purse, and she pulled out her father's leather-bound journal. McKenna's face went white. "My father," Eve announced, holding the journal high for everyone to see, "left behind some very interesting reading material." The murmurs started to ripple through the crowd. You see, Moses Booker wasn't just a homesteader, he was a federal land inspector, and he was documenting the systematic theft of minority-owned properties right here in this territory. The murmurs grew louder. McKenna took a step towards her, his face a mask of fury. "That's enough of your wild accusations." "Sheriff McKenna's name," Eve continued, her voice rising, cutting through his, "appears 67 times in these records, always connected to property seizures that happened right after very convenient accidents." McKenna's hand drifted down towards the butt of his pistol. "I'm placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace and making false accusations against an officer of the law." "On whose authority?" The voice boomed from the back of the crowd. It was a voice that carried the weight of true power. Heads turned. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. A tall man in a long duster coat strode through the opening. A federal marshal's badge gleamed on his vest. "Marshal James Harrison, United States Territory Court," he announced, his eyes fixed on McKenna. "And you are—" McKenna's face was a storm of confusion, then anger, then pure rat-like calculation. "Sheriff Dale McKenna, and this woman is making slanderous claims against upstanding citizens." "Is she now?" Harrison said, his face an unreadable mask of weathered leather. He looked at Eve. "Miss Booker, or I suppose it's Mrs. Carter now. I believe you sent me some correspondence." Eve's heart soared so high she thought it might burst from her chest. He had come. "Yes, Marshal," she said, her voice shaking with relief. "About my father's investigation into illegal land seizures." "Moses was my partner for 3 years," Harrison said, his gaze shifting back to McKenna, hard as granite. "Good man, thorough investigator. I've been looking into his death myself." The crowd stirred, a low, uneasy rumble. This was more than a wedding. This was a reckoning. Judge Harris stepped forward, trying to smooth things over with his oily charm. "Marshal, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately after the festivities." "There's no misunderstanding, Judge," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "I have federal warrants for several individuals in this territory." He pulled a thick fold of papers from inside his coat. "Including you." The judge's composure finally shattered. "This is outrageous. On what charges?" "Conspiracy to defraud the federal government," Harrison read, his voice like the tolling of a bell. "Illegal seizure of homestead properties. Falsification of court documents." He paused, his eyes finding McKenna again. "And murder." Bank President Wild, who had been trying to shrink into the background, made a break for it. He tried to edge away from the crowd. Harrison's eyes snapped to him instantly. "Mr. Wild, stay where you are. You're also named in these warrants." Panic erupted on the faces of the guilty. They were exposed, trapped in the open, in front of the very people they had terrorized for years. McKenna made one last, desperate play. He turned to the crowd. "This is all lies. It's federal overreach. These people are trying to destroy our town with their false accusations." "Then you won't mind if we examine your records," Harrison replied calmly. "Bank documents, court filings, property transfers. Federal authority supersedes your territorial jurisdiction, Sheriff." Eve stepped forward again, pressing the attack. "The Washington family lost their farm after gold was discovered nearby. The Martinez ranch was seized when they found silver. My father documented 12 other cases just like theirs." A woman pushed through the crowd. Her face was weathered and lined with grief, but her eyes burned with a fire that had been suppressed for too long. "It's true," Maria Martinez called out. "They said our papers were forged. They took everything we built." An older man, Samuel Washington, joined her. "The same thing happened to us. Judge Harris ruled against us, even with clear evidence." Suddenly, other voices rose from the crowd. The dam of fear had broken. Families who had been silent for years, terrified of retaliation, finally found the courage to speak their truth. The full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy was laid bare for everyone to see. McKenna's hand hovered over his gun. "I won't stand here and listen to these lies from—" "Draw that gun," Harrison warned, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "and I'll consider it threatening a federal officer." The sheriff's hand froze. His eyes darted around the square, looking for his allies, for his deputies. He found none. Even his own men were stepping back, their hands raised, unwilling to die for him against a U.S. Marshal. Judge Harris tried one last, pathetic bluff. "Marshal, surely you can see these people are emotionally distraught. Their claims have no proper legal foundation." "The foundation seems pretty solid to me," Harrison said, holding up another set of documents. "Your own court clerk has been cooperating with our investigation for months." The judge's face turned the color of ash. "Thomas Sinclair documented every falsified ruling, every backdated property transfer," Harrison continued, his voice relentless. "Before his convenient accident, of course." Maddie Sinclair stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, but her head held high. "My husband tried to do the right thing," she said, her voice ringing with grief and pride. "And they killed him for it." The mood of the crowd shifted for the last time. Sympathy for the victims turned into a palpable, rising tide of anger at the men who had betrayed them. Wild, the banker, made a final desperate run for it. He sprinted toward the edge of the square where horses were tied. Harrison didn't even raise his voice. He just drew his revolver in a single smooth motion. "Stop, or I'll shoot." Wild tripped and fell in a heap, his nerve utterly broken. Two of the townsmen he'd cheated grabbed him before he could get up. "Thank you, gentlemen," Harrison said with a grim nod. "Citizens' arrests are perfectly legal in cases of federal crimes." McKenna saw his entire empire of fear and corruption crumbling to dust around him. "It's a setup," he screamed, his voice cracking. "They're all lying. I've served this community faithfully for 8 years. By stealing everything they built." Eve's voice cut through his desperate protests. "My father's journal details every theft, every forged document, and every convenient death." Harrison calmly produced a set of iron shackles. "Sheriff McKenna, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Moses Booker. Judge Harris, Mr. Wild, you are also in federal custody." The three men, the pillars of corruption, who had ruled Copper Gulch for years, stood defeated and exposed in the middle of the town square. Justice hadn't just arrived. It had arrived on Eve's wedding day, with devastating, beautiful suddenness. "What happens to the stolen properties?" Samuel Washington asked, his voice filled with a hope he hadn't felt in years. "They will be returned to their rightful owners, or their heirs," Harrison replied, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "The federal court will sort through the legal mess these men created." Eve felt Jed's strong arm wrap around her shoulders, pulling her close. They had done it. Her father's work was finished. His death was avenged. "Mrs. Carter," Harrison said, a slight smile touching his lips for the first time, "your father would be very proud." Mrs. Carter. The name felt new and strong. In the space of a single hour, she had become a wife, and she had brought down a criminal empire. "There's still one more thing," she said, remembering the reason her father was killed. She produced the document proving her claim. "The homestead's mineral claims, the silver. All legitimate," Harrison confirmed with a nod. "Your inheritance is secure." The crowd began to disperse, not in fear, but in a buzz of excitement and relief. Years of oppression had ended. Justice hadn't come from the barrel of a gun. It had come from courage, and truth, and a dead man's journal. Jed squeezed her hand gently. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Carter?" "Home," Eve repeated softly. The word tasted different now. It wasn't just a cabin on a piece of land. It was a life. A life with a man who valued her mind and her strength. A life that could finally, truly begin. Once the conspirators were hauled away in chains, the wedding celebration resumed. But now it was real. The forced smiles were replaced with genuine joy. Townsfolk who had been afraid to even look Eve in the eye now came up to clap Jed on the back and thank her. their voices thick with emotion. Stories that had been whispered in secret for years were now shouted in the open. The Washington family described how they were run off their gold-rich farmland. The Martinez family told of the forged documents that stole their ranch. One after another, people came forward. Marshall Harrison listened to everyone, his pen scratching away in a notebook. He was building an ironclad case. Eve's father's journal was the skeleton, but these personal stories, these tales of heartbreak and resilience, were the flesh and blood that would guarantee convictions. Your courage gave them permission to speak, Harrison told Eve, as the celebration swirled around them. Fear kept these families silent for too long. Maddie Sinclair came over, her eyes still red from crying, but a smile on her face. "Thank you," she said, gripping Eve's hands, "for finishing what my Thomas started. He died trying to expose them." "Your husband's records made all the difference, Maddie," Eve replied. "His sacrifice wasn't in vain." The dressmaker smiled, a true smile that reached her eyes. He would be proud to see justice finally done. As evening fell, Jed and Eve finally slipped away from the party and rode to Jed's ranch. The day's events crashed over Eve in a dizzying wave. Justice had been served. Her marriage had begun. Her entire life had been transformed in a matter of hours. Jed's cabin was a haven of warm lamplight and quiet strength. His home was like him, sturdy, practical, but with unexpected touches of beauty. The furniture was hand-carved, showing an artist's skill hidden beneath his rugged exterior. Eve found herself standing at the doorway to the bedroom, and a sudden, crippling nervousness washed over her. The victories of the day felt a world away. Now all that was left was the intimidating reality of being a wife, of being with a man. "I've never shared a bed," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Jed came up behind her. His large hands rested gently on her shoulders. His touch was warm, reassuring. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "Terrified," she admitted, the truth coming out in a rush. He turned her around to face him, his kind eyes searching hers in the soft lamplight. "Of me?" "Of vulnerability," she whispered. "Of trusting someone completely." A slow, tender smile spread across Jed's face. "Then tonight, you'll share my heart too." He cupped her face in his calloused palms, his thumbs gently brushing away tears she hadn't even realized were falling. "We have all the time in the world, Eve," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "No rush, no pressure." His patience, his understanding, melted away the last of her fear. This gentle giant had been her protector, her partner, her champion. He had fought beside her for justice. Trusting him was the most natural thing in the world. Their wedding night wasn't a night of passion, but of quiet intimacy. They talked for hours, whispering secrets and dreams in the firelight. Gentle touches spoke more than grand declarations. Two lonely hearts, forged in conflict and conspiracy, were finally learning to beat as one. Dawn brought with it the practicalities of their new life. They now had two properties to manage: Jed's large ranch and Eve's homestead with its crucial water rights and the confirmed silver deposits. "We'll work both places," Jed decided over breakfast, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "We'll hire hands. We'll build something together." He looked at her across the table. Equal partners in everything. Their partnership bloomed. It was more than a marriage. It was a perfect collaboration. Eve's legal mind handled the paperwork, the contracts, the future of their enterprise. Jed's experience managed the land, the livestock, the day-to-day rhythm of the ranch. And within days, people started coming to them for help. The collapse of McKenna's regime had left a power vacuum and a tangled mess of property disputes. The federal court proceedings would take months, and people needed help now. So Eve, in the back room of Maddie's dress shop, started an informal legal aid service. She wasn't a lawyer, but her education and her father's notes made her the most qualified person in the territory. She helped families prepare their cases for the federal review. "Mrs. Martinez, your original homestead claim was completely valid," she explained to the woman whose voice had helped turn the tide. "The judge's ruling contradicted territorial law." "Can I get my ranch back?" Maria asked, her eyes wide with a fragile hope. Marshal Harrison says yes. The federal court will overturn the fraudulent seizure. That scene repeated itself dozens of times. The conspiracy hadn't just stolen land, it had stolen hope. Eve's work was slowly giving it back. Jed, meanwhile, managed their combined ranches with a quiet, steady competence. Their herds grew, their land prospered. The silver deposits remained untouched, a treasure waiting for the right, honest partners. "You've transformed this place," he told Eve one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over their peaceful valley. "The land, the community, everything. We transformed it together." "No," he said, taking her hand. "You brought something special here, something this territory desperately needed." "What's that?" "Hope." The trials began 6 weeks later. They were swift and decisive. Marshal Harrison laid out the federal case. Eve presented her father's journal, his meticulous documentation of their crimes. And then, one by one, their victims took the stand and told their stories. McKenna's defense was non-existent. There was too much evidence, too many witnesses. His years of intimidation had created a long line of people who were now eager to see him pay. Judge Harris was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. McKenna got 25. Bank President Wild received 15 years and was forced to pay financial restitution to his victims. The network was not just broken, it was annihilated. The property restorations began almost immediately. The Martinez Ranch was returned to its rightful owners. The Washington Farm was restored, with full mineral rights. Justice, once a distant dream, was now the law of the land in Copper Gulch. And as the first leaves of autumn began to turn, Eve discovered she was pregnant. The news was a quiet explosion of joy. The frontier was a dangerous place to have a child, but Jed's unbridled excitement washed away all her fears. "Another generation," he said, his huge hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Growing up in a more just world than the one we found." He looked at her, his eyes filled with love and awe. "Thanks to your father's courage and your determination to see it through." Their ranches thrived. Their future was secure. And in Copper Gulch, for the first time in years, the people elected a new sheriff in an honest vote. The community was healing. Eve's reputation began to spread. Letters started arriving from other territories, from other communities facing the same kind of corruption. They asked for her help, for her strategies. She became a beacon of hope for people fighting their own battles against the powerful and the corrupt. "You've become quite famous," Maddie observed one day. "Notorious, more like," Eve laughed. "No, truly famous," Maddie insisted. "People talk about the black woman from the East who brought down a corrupt sheriff and restored justice to an entire territory." The fame felt strange, but Eve welcomed it. If her story could inspire even one more person to fight back, then it was worth it. Winter came, but for the first time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a time of rest, of promise. Their ranch was ready, the community was safe, and a new life, a symbol of their future, grew within her. By the time spring arrived, painting the hills with wildflowers, Eve's pregnancy was a happy, obvious fact. The whole town, which had once shunned her, now greeted her with smiles and congratulations. Copper Gulch was reborn. New businesses were opening. Families were building new homes, confident in their future. Children played in the streets, their laughter replacing the silence of fear. Eve's informal legal aid service had grown into a network of advocates stretching across 3 territories, sharing information and strategies. Her father's fight had become her own, and it was a fight she was winning. One afternoon, Maria Martinez stopped by the ranch with a basket of vegetables. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Carter?" "Large and uncomfortable," Eve laughed, "but very happy. The baby kicks constantly. Jed thinks we're having a future rancher." Maria's own ranch was thriving again, a testament to the changes they had all fought for. The final piece of the new Copper Gulch had arrived 2 months earlier. Dr. Patricia Henderson, the territory's first female physician. Her presence was a comfort to Eve, another sign of a brighter, more progressive future. "Everything looks perfectly healthy," Dr. Henderson announced after a checkup. "The baby should be here within the month." Jed's excitement was a constant, joyful presence. He had converted a spare room into a nursery, and with his own hands he had crafted a beautiful wooden crib. The same hands that could calm a nervous horse or clench into a fist of righteous anger were now carving delicate details for his unborn child. "Are you worried about anything?" Eve asked him one evening as they watched the sunset. "Only the normal father worries," he said, his arm around her, "wanting to be good enough, worthy of this gift. You'll be an amazing father, Jed, with an incredible mother raising our child." Their partnership, born from strategy and danger, had deepened into a profound and unshakable love. The silver mining operation finally began, but under strict federal oversight. The profits were used to build schools and roads, benefiting the entire community. Marshall Harrison was a regular visitor, ensuring the transition to honest governance remained on track. "Your father would be amazed by what you've accomplished," he told Eve on his last visit. One woman's courage transformed an entire territory. "One woman with a lot of help from good people," she corrected him. "It still took one woman to take that first step." One beautiful April morning, her labor began. Dr. Henderson was there in minutes. Jed paced nervously outside. Hours later, the doctor emerged, smiling. "It's a girl," she announced, "healthy and strong." Jed entered the bedroom, his eyes filled with tears. Eve was exhausted but radiant, holding their daughter in her arms. The baby had her mother's determined eyes and her father's strong chin. "What should we name her?" Jed asked, his voice thick with awe. Eve looked down at the tiny, perfect face of their daughter, the living symbol of everything they had fought for. "Hope," she replied without a moment's hesitation. "Hope Booker Carter." "Perfect," Jed whispered. Their daughter would grow up in a world where justice mattered, where courage was rewarded, and where a person's character was more important than the color of their skin. It was a better world, a world her parents had built. The christening was held in the town square, the very same spot where the conspiracy had been brought to its knees. Now it was a place of celebration, of new life and endless possibility. As the years went on, Eve's work continued. She trained other women to understand the law, creating a self-sustaining network of justice advocates across the frontier. The territorial governor asked her to run for office. "You'd have my complete support," Jed told her. "Our daughter needs her mother," Eve said. "She also needs a world where women can achieve anything," he replied with a smile. One warm summer evening, they sat on their porch. The ranch was prosperous, the community was peaceful, and their daughter Hope slept in her cradle nearby. The same mountains that had once witnessed so much corruption and violence now looked down on a valley of peace. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," Jed observed quietly. Eve smiled, a familiar, loving exchange passing between them. Their love story had become a legend in the territory, the gentle giant and the determined woman from the east who brought justice to the frontier. But more than that, they had built a life, a family, and a future. Hope stirred in her sleep, her tiny hands grasping at dreams. She was dreaming of a world full of unlimited possibilities, a world her parents had created for her, through courage, through love, and through an unshakable belief that justice, in the end, would always prevail. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the forgotten corners of history.